Every screen in the watchtower turned red at once. The heroes of Earth had built sensors to warn them of every ending the universe could imagine: alien armadas, dying suns, the approach of gods. And on that night, those sensors caught two impossible things tearing through the wall between worlds and could make sense of neither. The first reading was pure appetite, a hunger old enough to eat universes, clawing its way in from somewhere that should not exist. The second reading was worse. The second reading was nothing. A blank space, a hole in creation, a void shaped exactly like death itself. And it was moving, and it was thinking, and it had landed somewhere in their world. Batman has a plan to kill every being he has ever met. Superman, the Justice League, gods, tyrants, and the end of all things. He has never, in all his careful preparations, built a contingency for what the second anomaly turned out to be. A polite teenager, lost and far from home, and carrying inside him the authority of a king of the dead. His name was Sung Suho. He came to the DC universe as a frightened boy looking for a way back, the son of a monarch, the heir to an ocean of shadow. And the worst part, the part that would change everything, was not the boy. It was the thing that had followed him through the wall to feed. The instruments had a single reference for that signature, buried deep in the archives, logged once and never explained. The reference was old and it was simple, and it made the watch officer's hands go cold as he read it. It was the signature the sensors gave to death itself. He sounded the alarm that woke the world's protectors from whatever passed for their rest, and across the watchtower, across the earth, across the dark places where stranger things kept their watch, the night turned red. In the House of Mystery, a building that exists in no single place and answers to no single law, the candles guttered all at once and burned blue. Its keeper rose from a chair that had not been sat in for 100 years, and went to a window that looked out on nothing, and stared a long time at a horizon only he could see. He had spent his unnatural life cataloging the things that should not be, and he knew the taste of a torn wall, and he knew the smell of a predator from another sphere. But the second presence, the void, the absence, the walking hole, that one stilled even him. "Something has come into our world," he murmured to the empty house, "that does not belong to life or to death, but stands above both and commands them." He did not know whether to be afraid. He decided, on long experience, that he would be. And far beyond the earth, beyond the reach of the League's censors, on a world of fire and tyranny at the dark edge of the universe, a being who had conquered 1,000 realities lifted his head from his throne. Darkseid felt few things. Wonder was not among them. He had unmade wonder in himself an eternity ago, the way a man pulls a weed. But the tremor that crossed the multiverse that night reached even Apocalypse, the wall between worlds torn, and the Lord of Apocalypse, who had spent his endless life searching for the anti-life equation, the formula that would grant him dominion over all free will, went very still upon his throne. He had felt the hungry thing and dismissed it. Appetite was common and beneath him. It was the other signature that held him. A presence that read as absolute authority over death, not the worship of it, not the wielding of it, but the sovereignty of it, the way a king is sovereign over a country he was born to rule. Darkseid had spent eternity coveting one power above all others. And here, bleeding into a backwater universe through a torn wall, was a being who seemed to own the very thing his equation was only a crude attempt to seize. "Find it," the Lord of Apocalypse said to the kneeling shadows of his court. His voice did not rise. It never needed to. "Whatever has entered the lower world wearing the authority of death, find it and bring it to me." The whole multiverse, in other words, had felt the wall break. The gods of 3 pantheons had turned their heads. The protectors of Earth were scrambling into the sky. The keepers of the strange and the lords of the dark were already reaching toward the 2 impossible signatures with hands of magic and machinery and malice. And the second signature, the void shaped like death, the thing that had stilled a sorcerer and woken a tyrant, was, at that exact moment, sitting on the cold concrete floor of an abandoned warehouse in a city he had never heard of, with his back against a rusted girder and his arms wrapped around his knees, trying very hard not to cry. His name was Sung Suho. He was 16 years old, and he was, by a margin he could not yet imagine, the most frightening thing on the planet. He had not asked for any of it. That was the part the censors could never have measured, the part the tyrant on his throne would never understand, that the void they had all felt tear into their universe was a boy who, an hour ago, had been home. He remembered the wall breaking. He remembered the thing, the hungry thing, the fragment, the splinter of an old and terrible power his father had warned him about in the careful way fathers warn children about the monsters that are real clawing through the barrier between worlds. And he remembered reaching for it the way his blood told him to, the way the authority humming beneath his skin demanded. And he remembered the tear catching him too, the riptide of it, the falling that was not falling. And then there had been this, a city that was not his city, a sky the wrong color, an air that tasted of a universe that had never once heard the name his father carried. Suho pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and breathed, the way he had been taught, and tried to think like the son of the man who had saved their world instead of like a scared kid alone in the dark. It did not entirely work. He was both, and the boy kept winning. "Okay," he whispered to the empty warehouse to himself in the voice of someone reciting a lesson to keep from panicking. "Okay, Dad got stranded too once. Dad always said assess first. Don't act scared even when you are, especially when you are." He swallowed. "Find out where you are, find the threat, then find the way home." He could feel the threat. That was the thing, the awful, useful thing. The fragment that had dragged him through was here, somewhere in this universe, loose and hungry and feeding, and Suho could feel it the way you feel a splinter under the skin, a wrongness pulling at the edge of his senses, the inherited instinct of a bloodline that had ruled over an entire category of existence telling him, without words, that does not belong, and it is your responsibility because no one else here knows what it is. And that was the loneliest part of all. He understood the thing that had followed him through. He knew what it was, what it ate, how it grew, how maybe it could be stopped. He was, in all probability, the only being in this entire universe who could track the predator now bleeding into it. And not one soul in this whole strange world knew he existed, or where he had landed, or that the void on their screens was a 16-year-old boy who wanted nothing in all of creation except to find his way back to his father's house. He lowered his hands. The authority stirred under his skin, restless, vast, patient, his inheritance, the ocean he carried, the thing that made sorcerers go still and tyrants lean forward on their thrones. He had spent his whole life being told what it meant to be the heir to it. He had never, until tonight, been entirely alone with it. "Dad," Suho said softly, to a universe that could not hear him, to a wall that had closed behind him, to the cold and the dark and the wrong-colored sky. "What do I do?" His father did not answer. His father was a universe away. So the boy did the only thing left to him. He climbed to his feet in the empty warehouse, and he wiped his face with the back of his hand, and he reached down into the ocean he had inherited, and from the shadows pooled in the corners of that abandoned place, something moved. A single shape rose up out of the dark at his feet, faithful and silent, the first soldier of an army he had not yet called. A shadow, his to command, the way the dead had been his father's to command before him. "Find it," Suho told it quietly, and somewhere on a throne of fire at the edge of the universe, a tyrant had given the very same order in the very same hour, and neither knew of the other yet. "The hungry thing, before it gets big enough that I can't." The shadow bowed and dissolved into the dark and was gone. And Sung Suho, the son of a monarch, the heir to death's own authority, the void that had woken half a multiverse, a scared and dutiful boy a universe from home, pulled his hood up against the cold and walked out of the warehouse into a city of strangers alone to hunt a predator that no one else even knew was here. Above him, the watchtower's sensors still burned red. Below him, the streets of an unfamiliar Earth slept on, unaware. And somewhere between the two, drawn inevitably toward the only signatures that mattered, the protectors of this universe were already coming for the hunger, and coming for the void, with no idea on any of their screens that one of the two things they were racing to contain was a child. They would find him soon, and when they did, they would have to decide what he was. The hunt for the predator had begun, so had something far more dangerous. The hunt for the boy. They came down out of the night sky like a verdict. The void signature had moved through the sleeping city for less than an hour before the protectors of Earth converged on it, because beings who guard a world do not wait politely when their sensors rep. Or a hole in creation walking their streets. Superman came first, a streak of red and blue against the wrong-colored clouds. Wonder Woman descended beside him, sword sheathed but ready, a daughter of gods who had measured the worth of monsters since before this city had a name. And somewhere in the shadows of a rooftop, because that was always where he chose to be, the Batman watched and said nothing, and began, in the cold, methodical engine of his mind, to do the thing he did with every new power that entered his world. He began to plan how to stop it. They expected a monster. Every instrument they carried had told them to expect a monster, an absence shaped like death, a void that had stilled the keeper of the House of Mystery and woken the Lord of Apocalypse on his distant throne. They descended on an alley between two warehouses with the readiness of warriors who had ended gods, braced for the worst thing the night could show them. And the worst thing the night could show them was a teenager, standing very still with his hands raised, trying not to look afraid. For a moment, no one spoke. The whiplash of it landed on Earth's mightiest heroes exactly as it had landed on their screens. The impossible gap between what the sensors screamed and what stood before them in a hooded jacket. A boy of perhaps 16, slight and tired, and visibly bracing for violence the way kids brace who have learned that the world arrives swinging. "I don't want to fight you," the boy said. His voice was steady. It cost him something to keep it that way, and the heroes who had spent their lives reading the fear under brave voices could all hear the price. I'm not the thing your sensors are looking for. I mean, I am one of the things, but I'm not the dangerous one. There's another one. It came through with me, and it's hunting right now, and every minute we stand here is a minute it gets bigger." He swallowed. "Please. We don't have time for this part." "Identify yourself," Wonder Woman said, not unkindly, but a daughter of the Messira does not lower her guard for a steady voice. "What are you?" And there it was, the question that the whole night turned on, the question the sensors couldn't answer, the question that would haunt every one of them before it was through. "What are you?" Not who. The boy heard the difference, the way he had heard it his whole life, and something old and sad crossed his young face. "My name is Suho," he said, "and that's a longer answer than we have time for." It might have held there, might have stayed a tense, talkable standoff between cautious heroes and a careful boy, if the city had given them the time. It did not. Far across the sleeping streets, the hungry thing fed the heroes felt it, a lurch in the dark, the predator from another world tearing into something to grow, and the shock of it rippled through the alley, and one of the newer arrivals, a younger hero strung tight on a night of impossible readings, reacted to the surge the way the trained react to sudden cosmic violence. A bolt of force lanced toward the unidentified anomaly, toward the boy. What happened next, every hero present would replay for a long time afterward. The boy did not flinch, and the boy did not strike back, and the boy did not, in any way the eye could follow, appear to do anything at all. But the shadows in the alley moved. They rose off the walls and the ground in a single silent surge, a curtain of living dark that caught the bolt of force and simply swallowed it. No flare, no detonation, just absence, the energy gone as though it had never been thrown. And then the shadows settled back into the corners of the alley, faithful and quiet, and the boy stood exactly where he had stood, hand still raised, expression apologetic. "Please don't," Suho said softly. "I don't want anyone to get hurt. That's kind of the whole problem. I'm really good at making sure people don't get hurt." A pained, exhausted honesty. "It's the only thing I'm actually trying to be good at." The alley had gone very still, because the heroes had seen, in that single silent instant, the truth the censors had been trying to warn them of, that the slight, tired boy in the hooded jacket had, without effort, without anger, without even seeming to try, commanded the darkness itself to defend him. And the darkness had obeyed, the way an army obeys a king it loves. The void on their screens had a shape now. It was the shape of a teenager who could unmake them and was politely choosing not to. And it was at that moment that Raven arrived. She came not from the sky but from the dark, stepping out of a doorway of shadow she had folded out of the night, drawn across the city by a thing none of the League's machines could measure. Because Raven did not read the world with sensors. She read it with her soul. The daughter of a demon, raised in dread of the monster whose blood ran in her, had spent her whole life feeling the spy. Ritual weather of the beings around her, the colors of their souls, the shapes of their darkness. And from the moment the wall broke, she had felt the second signature more clearly and more terribly than any instrument on earth. A presence so vast and so deep that it had pulled at her across the entire city, the way the ocean pulls at a held breath. She had come expecting to face the worst thing she had ever felt. She reached for him the way she reached for everyone, a brush of empathy, a touch of soul against soul, the gentle, invasive instinct she could no more switch off than she could stop her own heartbeat. She reached into Sung Suho to read what he was. And Raven, who had stood inside her own father's mind and survived it, who had felt the souls of gods and monsters and the truly damned, gasped and took a step back, because what lay behind the polite, tired boy was not a soul like other souls. It was an ocean. An endless dark, vast beyond the edges of her sight, patient as deep water, layered with the weight of an authority so old and so absolute that her empathy reeled at the scale of it. Not the worship of death, not the fear of it, but the quiet sovereign ownership of it, an inheritance poured into one slight human vessel, deep enough to drown a world. And in that ocean of shadow, something turned and looked back at her. It should have been the most frightening moment of Raven's life. It was not, because as her soul brushed the vastness behind the boy's eyes, as she braced for the malice, the hunger, the cold appetite that such power surely concealed, she found instead the boy himself, small and scared and kind, carrying an ocean he had never asked for, bracing every second against the violence he expected from a world that had only ever seen his power and never once asked about the child holding it. Trying, with everything he had, not to hurt anyone, because the weight he carried terrified him more than it could ever terrify them. Raven knew that feeling. Raven had lived inside that feeling her entire life. The daughter of Trigon, who had spent every day of her existence being feared for the blood in her veins, judged for a parent she did not choose, braced against a world that saw the monster before it saw the girl, reached into the son of a monarch of death. And instead of the evil everyone in that alley was bracing for, she felt a mirror. And for one long, silent moment, across the contact of soul against soul, the boy who carried an ocean of shadow and the girl who carried a demon's blood looked at each other and recognized something that neither of them had ever found in another living person. "You too," the recognition said without words. "You carry one too, you know." Neither of them said anything. Neither of them looked away. And something passed between them in that alley that none of the watching heroes could see, and that neither of the two who felt it would have known how to name. A current, quiet and sudden and entirely unexpected, the strangest and least frightening thing in a night built of fear. Raven withdrew her empathy with a care she rarely bothered to use, and turned to the assembled heroes, and said the thing that began the argument that would divide them for the rest of the night. Telling the truth, her voice was flat, certain, and unsettled in a way her teammates had learned to take seriously. "He doesn't want to hurt anyone, I felt it." A pause. "And before anyone asks, yes, the power is real. It's bigger than anything I've ever touched. bigger than my father. But the boy, she looked back at Suho just once, the boy is exactly what he says he is. He's a kid who's lost and scared and trying to do the right thing in a universe that already decided he's a weapon. On the rooftop above the alley, in the dark where he had said nothing and missed nothing, the Batman listened to all of it, the swallowed energy, the obedient shadows, the empath's verdict, and came, in the cold engine of his mind, to a conclusion that had nothing to do with whether the boy was kind. That is precisely the problem, he thought. He had a plan to kill Superman. He had a plan to kill every member of the League, every metahuman, every god who walked the earth, protocols built in the long sleepless nights, contingencies for the day a friend became a threat, because the lesson of his entire life was that power without an answer was simply a catastrophe that hadn't happened yet. And every one of those plans had a handle, a weakness, a pattern, a lever, kryptonite, magic, psychology. He had never met a power he could not, given time and study, find the seam in. He looked down at the boy in the alley, the boy his sensors could not scan, whose authority his instruments read as a void, whose intentions the empath swore were gentle. And the Batman felt, for one of the very few times in his life, the cold absence of a handle. He could not measure this power. He could not predict it, would not find its seam. And the kindness, the politeness, the visible decency of the child holding it, that did not reassure him. It did the opposite. Because a being that powerful and that kind was a being whose restraint was the only thing standing between the world and annihilation, and Bruce Wayne had built his entire life on a single iron refusal. He did not trust the world's survival to anyone's restraint, not even his own. So while Superman descended slowly into the alley with his hands open and his face gentle, while Wonder Woman lowered her guard a degree, while Raven stood watch over the strange boy she had just recognized, the Batman, in the dark, quietly began to build the thing he built for every power he could not control. He began to design the contingency for how to kill a child who commanded death itself. He did not enjoy it. He never did. But power was power, and the kindness of the hand that held it changed nothing about the size of the fist. Down in the alley, Superman came to rest before the boy, and did the thing that flipped the whole night on its axis. The thing only he of all of them would have thought to do first. He did not ask, "What are you?" He had been asked that question himself once, a frightened child who fell from a dying world into a Kansas field, and he had spent his life learning the difference between the question that contains a person and the question that contains a threat. "Suho," the man of steel said gently, crouching down so his eyes were level with the boy's, ignoring the readings, ignoring the swallowed energy, ignoring the void on every screen above them. "Where are your parents?" And the alley went silent, because the question landed on the assembled heroes like cold water, and every one of them heard, in the space it opened, exactly what they had been doing. They had surrounded a lost child with the power of gods and demanded to know what he was. And Superman, alone among them, had looked past the ocean and seen the kid drowning in it, and asked the only question that mattered. Suho's careful steadiness cracked, just slightly, just for a moment, the brave voice faltering on the one question no one had thought to ask, the question that reached all the way down to the scared boy a universe from home. "My dad," Suho said quietly, and something vast and grieving moved behind his young eyes, "is the reason I can do any of this. And he's not here. He's really far away." He looked from Superman to Wonder Woman to the empath who had recognized him, to the dark on the rooftop where he could feel, without being able to see, something cold and watchful taking his measure. "And if you want to understand what I am, before that thing out there gets big enough to eat your world, then you should probably let me tell you about him." The heroes of Earth stood in the alley, divided already between the empath who had felt his soul and the shadow on the roof building a way to end him, between the question that contained a person and the question that contained a threat. And none of them yet knew that the answer the boy was about to give them would change not one universe, but two. "Tell us," Superman said. And far across the city in the dark, The hungry thing fed again and grew. The boy began to speak, and the mightiest beings on earth fell silent to listen. And the dark itself, the shadows pooled in every corner of that alley, seemed to lean in close, the way a thing leans toward the sound of its own king's blood. "Where I come from," Suho said, "the world almost ended, not the way worlds end in stories, slowly, door by door." He looked at the ground for a moment, gathering it. Gates started opening, tears in reality leaking monsters into the cities, and humanity learned to fight back. We grew hunters, people with abilities, and the strong ones became legends, and the weak ones became corpses. A breath. My father was the weakest of them all. That landed wrong in the alley. The heroes had braced to hear a tyrant's origin, a litany of conquest, and the gap between what they expected and what the boy was saying opened wider with every sentence. They called him the weakest hunter in the world. A joke. A man who walked into the lowest, safest dungeons and still nearly died in them, who took the jobs no one else would because they were all he could survive, who kept going back into the dark long after any sane person would have quit. Because he had a mother in a hospital bed and a little sister in school, and someone had to pay for them, and he was all they had. Suho's voice was quiet and certain, the voice of a son reciting scripture he had been raised on. That's who my father was before any of it. Not a king, not a god. A poor man who kept walking into danger because the people he loved needed him too. And the legend unspooled then, in the boy's careful telling, and the narration of it filled the alley like something half-remembered, the saga of a man the heroes of this universe had never heard of and would never forget. He told them of the day his father walked into a dungeon that should have killed him, and did not, of the second chance that found him there in the dark, the power that began to grow in a man everyone had written off, the slow and terrible ascent from the weakest thing in the world toward something the world had no name for. He told them how the strength came with a price no one else could see. That to grow, his father had to walk further into the dark than anyone had ever walked. That the power he was inheriting was not the power of fire or light or strength, but the power over the dead, the authority to command what came after the end, to raise the fallen as faithful shadows, to become, by slow and lonely degrees, the sovereign of death itself. He didn't want it, Suho said. That's the part nobody understands until it's too late. The power over death isn't a gift, it's a weight. Every step up that ladder, he got more alone, because there was no one above him to share it with, and no one below him who could understand it. He became the strongest being his world had ever seen, and the loneliest. Because being the one who stands at the top of death means being the one who holds the door shut, alone, against everything on the other side of it. The shadows in the alley stirred at the words, and Raven, who had felt the ocean, who alone among them understood what the boy was describing, closed her eyes, because she knew, in her own demon-blooded marrow, exactly the loneliness he meant. And then the real war came, Suho said, and his young voice dropped and the alley went colder. Not gates, not monsters, monarchs, forces older than humanity, powers that had eaten worlds before ours and meant to eat ours next, and the greatest of them was a thing of pure destruction, a king of ruin so vast that armies meant nothing to it, that hope meant nothing to it, that nothing in all creation could stand against it. He looked up and met Superman's eyes, except one man, the weakest hunter in the world, who had walked so far into the dark and carried so much weight and lost so much of himself doing it, that by the end he was the only being alive who could stand in the doorway and say no. What did he do? Wonder Woman asked, and even the warrior princess of the Masira had lowered her sword entirely now, caught in the gravity of the tale. Everything, Suho said simply. He gave everything. He fought a war that no one else could even see the size of, and he won it, and the cost. The boy's composure thinned just slightly, the grief showing through the legend. The cost was that he had to carry it alone. He took the whole weight of it onto himself, all the death, all the burden of being the one sovereign who could hold that door, so that no one else in the entire world ever had to, so that everyone could just live. Wake up in a world that was saved and not even know how close it came and not even know the name of the man who paid for it. He didn't want monuments. He didn't want worship. He wanted his family at the dinner table and a world quiet enough for them to grow old in. Suho's jaw tightened against something. He became death itself so that everyone he loved could be ordinary. That's what my father is. That's the monster your sensors were screaming about. The alley was utterly silent. Because the gap had closed all the way, and every hero standing in it felt the floor of their assumptions drop out. They had come down out of the sky braced to face the air of an apocalypse, the spawn of some dark conqueror, the inheritor of a monster's appetite. And instead they were standing before a boy whose voice broke when he talked about his father, telling them, with a child's total and unembarrassed love, that the most terrifying power their universe had ever detected belonged to a bloodline whose entire reason for existing was to protect, to carry the unbearable so that others wouldn't have to become the thing that frightens the dark so that the people behind you can sleep. And the piece he bought, Superman said quietly, the only one of them who had truly understood from the first question, is the world you grew up in. I never needed any of this. Suho gestured at himself, at the obedient shadows at the ocean Raven had felt. That was the whole point of him. I grew up safe. I grew up with a dad who came to my games and burned breakfast and pretended he wasn't the strongest being in existence, because to me, he was just my father. The authority is mine now. I'm his son. It's my inheritance. It woke up in me the way it woke up in him. But he raised me in the peace he paid for, and he taught me the only thing he ever really cared about teaching me. The boy looked around the alley at the gods and warriors who had surrounded a frightened child with the readiness to kill him. Strength is for protecting people. It's not for ruling them, and it's not for frightening them, and it's never for hurting the ones who can't fight back. That's not a power I inherited. That's a promise. And I came into your universe by accident, and I'm sorry, and I want to go home, but there is a piece of the thing my father died fighting loose in your world right now, and I am the only person here who knows what it is. So you can spend tonight deciding whether to fear me, or you can let me do what my family was made to do. And it was Raven who answered first. She stepped forward, out of the line of cautious heroes, and she looked at the boy with the ocean inside him, and she said the words that no one had ever said to her in her entire life. And that was precisely why she, of all of them, knew to say them now. I believe you. Her voice was flat and certain and carried something underneath it that her teammates had never heard there before. And I know exactly what you are, Suho, because I'm one too. She let that sit. My father isn't a hero. My father is a demon, a real one, a thing that eats worlds, the closest thing to evil this universe has a name for. I've got his blood in me. I've spent my whole life watching people look at me the way all of you just looked at you, seeing the monster before they see the person, deciding what I am before they ever ask who, bracing for the apocalypse and finding a scared kid who never wanted any of it. She turned to face the League and the younger heroes gathering behind her in the dark, the Titans, drawn to the scene the way she had been drawn, watching now with new and softening eyes. He's not his father's power. He's his father's promise. I felt it. I'd stake my life on it. A beat quieter just for him, and the unspoken current ran between them again. I know what it costs to be the kid who has to keep proving he's not the thing in his own blood. He shouldn't have to do it alone in a universe that isn't even his. Something moved in Suho's face, the look of someone who had braced for the whole world to flinch and found, against all expectation, one person who didn't. Who couldn't because she stood on the same lonely ground he did. And in the dark behind Raven, the Titans who had come braced to fight a void looked at the boy and saw what she saw, not a weapon, not a monster's heir. A kid their age, carrying too much far from home. Up here, the warmth of it began to fill the alley, the first warmth of the whole night, Starfare's open curiosity, the younger one's wary thaw, the slow turning of a hostile circle into something that might, given a chance, become a welcome. But not everyone thawed. On the rooftop above them, in the dark where he had listened to every word, the weakest hunter, the lonely sovereign, the world bought with one man's sacrifice. The promise passed from father to son. The Batman finished the first draft of his contingency and felt nothing soften in him at all. Because the story changed nothing he cared about. A kind father, a dutiful son, a promise to protect. He believed all of it. And it was irrelevant, because Bruce Wayne had buried too many people who'd been failed by someone's good intentions, and the lesson never changed. The size of the power was the only fact that mattered, and the kindness of the boy holding it was simply the reason no one else in that alley would ever agree to build the answer he was already building. Promises break, he thought, watching the boy the others had begun to love. Inheritances corrupt. And the only thing standing between this world and an ocean of death is the restraint of a 16-year-old. Restraint is not a security system. His cold eyes did not waver. Someone has to be the answer if the promise ever fails. Someone always has to be the answer. He said nothing. He never did. But the contingency had a name now, filed in the dark beside the one he kept for Superman, and it would not be unmade by anything the boy did right. Down in the alley, Suho looked from the empath who had defended him, to the heroes beginning to lower their guard, to the dark on the rooftop where he could still feel something cold and unconvinced taking his measure. And he managed, for the first time since he'd fallen out of his own universe, something that was almost a smile. "Thank you," he said to Raven, and meant it more than the words could hold. And then his head snapped up, and the almost smile died, and every shadow in the alley stood up at once. Because he had felt it, the splinter under his skin, the wrongness he had been tracking since the warehouse, and it had just done the thing he'd been racing the whole night to prevent. Across the city, the hungry thing had finished feeding. It had grown enough. And now, gorged and patient no longer, the fragment of the monarch of destruction reached out across this new universe with the first full flex of its returning power. And every hero in the alley staggered as the night itself seemed to bruise, a pressure rolling over the city like the shadow of a thing too large to see. "It's done eating," Suho said, very quietly, and the boy was gone from his voice now, and something of his father had come into it instead. "It knows I'm here, and it just decided it's strong enough to come for both of us." Far across the city, something vast and ravenous turned its attention toward a single alley, and far beyond the stars, on a throne of fire, a tyrant who had been listening through agents of shadow smiled, because the war he wanted had just begun, and it would draw the boy with the authority of death right out into the open where apocalypse could reach him. The heroes had spent the night deciding what Sung Suho was. They were about to find out. The thing about a ticking clock is that everyone hears it differently. They had pulled back to regroup, the League, the Titans, and the strange boy at the center of it all, because the fragments flecks across the city had made one thing brutally clear. This was no longer a question of whether to trust Suho, but of how fast they could stop arguing and move. And as they regrouped, the clock ran. Across the city, the predator from another universe fed and grew and gathered itself, patient and enormous, and every minute the protectors of Earth spent circling the boy who could track it was a minute the real monster spent getting larger. Suho felt it the worst. He could feel the fragment swelling at the edge of his senses like a held breath that would not stop expanding, and the helplessness of it. "I'm the only one here who knows, and they're all still deciding what I am," sat on him like a stone. But for the first time since he'd fallen out of his own world, he was not entirely alone with it. Because the Titans had decided. A boy his own age dropped onto the wall beside him, broad-shouldered, lightning-marked, with a grin that did not belong on someone that powerful. Shazam wore the body of a god and the heart of a kid, and he looked at the most frightening anomaly in the universe and saw, with the unerring radar of one teenager finding another, somebody to talk to. "Commander of the dead, huh? That's metal, like actually metal," he nudged him. "I turn into this when I say a magic word. A wizard gave it to me. You ever get told you've got the weight of the world, and then immediately have to take a math test. And Suho, the heir to death's authority, the void that had woken a tyrant, let out a startled breath that was almost a laugh, the first one in this universe. Because for one absurd, weightless moment he was not a monarch's son or a cosmic threat. He was just a kid sitting on a wall, being talked at by another kid, in the one register he had not heard since he fell through the wall. His own. All the time, Suho admitted. My dad's the strongest being who ever lived, and he still made me study for finals. See, Shazam threw up his hands, vindicated. Nobody believes me about that part. It was a small thing. It was the largest thing that had happened to Suho all night. Because around that small thing the rest of the Titans gathered, wary, then warming, the way the young do when they decide someone is one of theirs. And Starfire's open warmth, and the easy banter, and Raven standing quiet at the edge of it with the ghost of something almost like peace on her face. All of it built into a thing Sue had not expected to find in a universe that had met him with raised weapons. A place, a people, the first one this world had offered him. And on the far side of that warmth, drawn by the exact opposite instinct, the powers came to take his measure. The first arrived like a thunderclap. Black Adam descended into the courtyard with the gravity of a falling monument, and the temperature of the regroup changed instantly, because the ancient champion of Kondak had not come for warmth. He had felt the boy's authority from across the world, the way a king feels another crown enter his country, and he had come to do what kings do when they sense an heir to a throne older than their own. He had come to measure it. They tell me, Black Adam said, his voice the grind of millennia, walking towards Suho through the parting titans, that you are the son of a god of death, the inheritor of a kingdom F the slain. His dark eyes raked the boy unimpressed, weighing. I have ruled and outlived and buried empires. I know the difference between a king and a child wearing a king's colors. So show me, boy, which are you? He moved without warning, not to kill, but to test. A strike of God-touched force that would have leveled a building, aimed at the boy to see what the boy would do. Suho did not strike back. That was the thing Black Adam would remember. The shadows rose vast, instant. The ocean raven had felt surging up around the boy in a wall of living dark, and they did not lash out, did not retaliate, did not so much as bare a fang. They caught the blow, held a god's strength suspended in a curtain of silent shadow, contained it, and set it gently aside, while the boy at the center stood unmoved and unharmed and entirely without anger. My father taught me that strength is for protecting people, Suho said quietly into the ringing aftermath. Not for proving things to kings. If you want to test me against the thing eating your world, not against your own city's heroes. Black Adam stared at the boy who had caught his blow without returning it, and slowly, something that was not quite a smile but was certainly respect moved across the ancient face. Restraint, he said, at that scale, few who could destroy choose not to. He inclined his head a fraction, the closest thing to a bow a king of Kondak gave anyone. You are your father's son, Shadow Prince. I have measured you. You will do. Wonder Woman had been watching the whole of it, and she came forward now with the assessing eye of a warrior who had judged the worth of fighters since before this world had history. She had seen how he stood, how he absorbed, how the power answered him without his ever seeming to call it. I have fought beside gods and against them, she told him. And the truest measure of a warrior is never how hard they strike. It is what they refuse to strike. Her hand settled briefly on his shoulder, judgment rendered, approval given. You fight to shield. That is the oldest and best kind of strength there is. When the predator comes, child, you will not stand alone. It should have been the warmest moment of the night. The boy, measured by gods and found worthy, surrounded by peers who'd claimed him, told he would not stand alone. It was the exact moment the sky tore open. Not the gentle bruising of the fragment's flecks. A boom, a corridor of fire and tube light ripping into the courtyard from somewhere infinitely worse than this universe, and through it poured the foot soldiers of the darkest power in all creation. Parademons, a screeching swarm of them, and at their head, a withered, smiling emissary in the robes of apocalypse, his eyes alight with his master's hunger. Because far across the cosmos, on his throne of fire, Darkseid had finished taking the boy's measure too, and the Lord of Apocalypse had reached, at last, for the prize. The great Darkseid extends an invitation, the emissary purred, as his swarm fanned out and the Titans snapped into formation around Suho. He has spent an eternity seeking dominion over death, the anti-life, the authority to command what lies beyond the end. And here, fallen into this wretched little world, walks a boy who was born holding it. The smile widened. You will come to Apocalypse, Shadow Prince, willing or otherwise. My master does not ask twice for things he intends to own. What followed was short and it was vicious, and it forged in fire the thing the warmth had only begun. The Parademons came for the boy, and the Titans met them, Starfire's bolts, Shazam's thunder, Raven's dark, Wonder Woman and Black Adam carving through the swarm, and Suho fought with them, the shadows pouring off him in a disciplined tide that turned the emissary's incursion back on itself. He did not slaughter. Even now, even against the soldiers of hell, the boy fought to repel, not to destroy, shadows binding, hurling, shielding his newfound allies, the inheritor of death holding his terrible authority on a leash even in the heat of it. And when the emissary's force broke and fled screaming back into the boom tube, Suho stood breathing hard at the center of the Titans, and understood that he had just fought his first battle in this universe shoulder to shoulder with people who had chosen to stand beside him. But the emissary's parting words hung in the smoke. My master does not ask twice for things he intends to own, and far away on his throne, Darkseid was not displeased. He had not expected to take the boy on the first reach. He had wanted to see him, and what he had seen was an authority over death that dwarfed his own crude equation, walking free in a universe too weak to keep it. The Lord of Apocalypse would have it. He would wait, and he would scheme, and he would let this world's other troubles soften the prize for him. Patience was the one luxury a god of tyranny could always afford. So there they were, the two futures, opened in a single night, pulling at the boy from opposite directions. On one side, a found family, the Titans who had claimed him, the kings who had judged him worthy, the empath who saw her own soul in his, a place to belong in a universe not his own. On the other, a coveted weapon, the Lord of Apocalypse reaching across the stars for the one power he had never possessed, certain that a thing so valuable could only ever be a thing to own. And in the dark, a third shadow watched both futures and trusted neither, because the Batman had seen the boy catch a god's blow and turn back the armies of hell without killing, had watched gods and tyrants alike decide what the child was, and his cold calculus had not moved an inch. Beloved by the Titans, coveted by Darkseid, it changed nothing. The contingency stayed filed in the dark, because to Bruce Wayne, belonging and being coveted were two names for the same fact. An ocean of power that every force in the universe was now reaching for, and that one boy's restraint was the only thing keeping in its banks. Down in the smoking courtyard, Suho lowered the shadows and looked at the friends who had fought beside him, and felt, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the dread of apocalypse, beneath the cold weight he could feel watching from the dark, something he had not felt since his own world. Not alone. And that was the instant the fragment chose to stop feeding. It came without warning, the way the worst things always did. The held breath at the edge of Suho's senses finally, fully released, and across the entire city, every light died at once. The night did not bruise this time. It broke. A pressure rolled out from the heart of the metropolis vast enough to drive gods to their knees, and on the horizon, rising over the skyline like a second and terrible dawn, something began to unfold itself into the sky, enormous, ravenous, and awake. The fragment of the monarch of destruction had finished growing. It had taken the measure of this universe while the universe argued over a boy. And now, gorged and patient no longer, it rose over the city to do the only thing its kind had ever done. Devour everything. It's here, Suho breathed, and the boy who had laughed on a wall an hour ago was gone entirely now. Everyone who's been wondering what I really am. He stepped forward, and the ocean rose behind his eyes, and for the first time in this universe, he stopped holding it back. "You're about to find out." It unfolded over the city like the end of the world, because that was precisely what it was. The fragment of the monarch of destruction had been a splinter when it tore through the wall, a sliver of a thing that had eaten universes, starved and patient and small. It was not small anymore. It had spent the night feeding on the substance of this reality, gorging on a piece of the DC multiverse itself, and now it rose over the skyline fully woken, a vastness of teeth and ruin and hunger that blotted out the broken sky, an apocalypse with an appetite. The surviving ember of the very war Sung Jinwoo had given everything to win, and it had crossed an entire universe to start that war again somewhere fresh. Earth's mightiest threw themselves against it, and Earth's mightiest were not enough. Superman hit it with the force that moved planets, and the monster absorbed him, folding the impact into its own growing mass. Wonder Woman and Black Adam carved at its flanks, and the wounds sealed faster than they could open them, because you cannot bleed a thing that is made of devouring. Starfire's bolts, Shazam's thunder, the full fury of the League and the Titans together, all of it broke against the fragment like surf against a cliff, and the cliff only grew, and the city died beneath it block by block as the Predator fed on everything it touched. This was the truth the heroes of this universe had never faced. A thing from outside their stories, immune to their rules, that did not want to conquer or rule or be reasoned with. It wanted to eat, and it would eat their world, and then the next, and then the rest, the way it had eaten all the worlds before, unless something stood in the doorway and said no. And in the heart of the dying city, the polite, frightened, careful boy they had spent the whole night judging finally stepped aside. What rose in his place, the protectors of Earth would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Suho did not shout. He did not transform. He simply stopped holding back, and the ocean Raven had felt behind his eyes, the vastness that had stilled a sorcerer and woken a tyrant, the authority their every sensor had read as a hole where a threat should be, came up out of the boy and into the world. The shadows of the dying city answered him first, peeling off every surface and pooling at his feet. Then the dark deepened, and from it the army came. They rose in their thousands, in their tens of thousands. DS, soldiers of shadow, knights and beasts and titans of living dark, an entire host of the faithful dead pouring up out of the ground at the command of the one who ruled them. This was the inheritance. This was the Shadow Monarch's authority made manifest, not a power of fire or light or strength, but the sovereignty over an entire category of existence, the dominion of the King of the Dead, and it filled the broken sky with an army that had no end. The heroes of this universe finally understood, in one terrible, breathtaking instant, why their machines had read the boy as death itself. Because their machines had been right. "Now you see," Suho said, and his voice carried across the ruined city with the weight of his father's legend behind it. And the boy was still in there, the kindness, the grief, the promise, but it was wrapped now in the full and terrible majesty of what he had been born to be. "I told you what my father was. This is what I am, the sovereign of the dead, the one who holds the door." His shadow army arrayed itself against the apocalypse, an ocean of the dark facing an ocean of ruin. And the thing my father died to stop is not getting a second world. The prey of an entire multiverse, the predator that had eaten reality after reality, that had never once met a thing it could not devour, looked down at the boy and his army of shadows. And for the first time in its long and ravenous existence, the hunter that fed on universes met something it could not eat. It met death's own authority, and death cannot be devoured. Death is the thing that waits on the other side of everything, the fragment included. The war turned. It did not turn easily, and it did not turn quickly, but it turned because now there was a host in the field that did not break against the monster the way flesh and even gods had broken. The shadow army crashed into the fragment in a tide of living dark, and where the hero's blows had been absorbed, the shadows bound, wrapping the devouring thing in the authority of the very end it had spent eternity outrunning. Suho stood at the eye of it, conducting an army of the dead against an apocalypse, and the League and the Titans rallied around him, fighting now not in despair, but in the fierce new hope of warriors who have found, at last, the one ally who changes the math. Even the forces of Apocalypse were drawn into it, Darkseid's distant hand throwing his Parademon legions at the fragment, because the Lord of Apocalypse wanted no rival predator loose in the field where his coveted prize fought, and would happily spend his soldiers to thin a competitor. A multiverse at war, a boy at its center, and the prey-turned predator high of it rolled through the broken city like a held breath finally, gloriously released. The thing that hunted worlds, hunted now in its turn, run to ground by the inheritor of the one power older than its hunger. But the fragment was vast, and it had fed well, and binding was not ending. Suho felt the truth of it through the authority in his blood, that the shadows could hold the monster, could wound it, could turn its advance, but could not finish it, because to truly unmake a thing that was a piece of the monarch of destruction itself, he would have to reach deeper into his inheritance than he ever had. He would have to stop being a boy wielding a king's power, and become, fully and without reservation, the sovereign of death that his father had been, to take up the whole crushing weight of the authority, the loneliness and the dominion and the terrible total ownership of the end, and wear it the way Jinwoo had worn it, alone in the doorway against the dark. That was the cost. That was what he had to become to win, and the boy hesitated at the edge of it, because he had seen what it cost his father, the loneliness of standing at the top of death, and some frightened 16-year-old part of him did not know if he could carry it and still come back as himself. It was then that the war went quiet. Not stopped quiet. As though the city, the monster, the armies of shadow and hell and gods had all been turned down to a hush, and into that hush, where the deepest authority over the dead had begun to stir, walked someone the heroes of this universe knew and feared, and had never once expected to simply see. She was not vast. She was not terrible. She came across the ruined battlefield as a slight young woman, pale and dark-eyed and kind, with a small gentle smile that did not belong anywhere near an apocalypse. And the moment she appeared, the fragment recoiled, and the gods went silent, and even Suho's endless army of the dead bowed low, because they knew, as all dead things know, exactly who had come. Death of the endless, the eldest kindness in all creation, the one who waits at the end of every life, gentle and patient and without judgment, the function and the friend of every ending there had ever been or would ever be. She had not come to fight. GHT. Death does not fight. Death simply is the destination of all roads. She had come because something wielding the authority over the dead had entered her domain, and she wanted, with the simple curiosity of the oldest gentle thing in the universe, to look at it. She walked through the war as though it were a quiet garden, and she came to the boy at the eye of it, and she looked at Sung Suho, at the ocean of shadow, at the army of the faithful dead, at the inheritance of a king of death from a universe that was not her own, and she tilted her head, and her smile did not waver. "Oh," said Death softly, and there was no fear in it and no anger, only a vast and tender recognition. "There you are. I felt you come in. I wondered what you'd be." She regarded the shadow army, the boy, the whole terrible majesty of the shadow monarch's inheritance with the warmth of someone meeting a distant cousin at the door. "You're not me. You're not what your friends are so afraid you are either. You don't end things." Her dark eyes were kind. "You keep them. You're a shepherd, little king. The dead aren't your victims. They're your flock." And in that single gentle sentence, everything the heroes of this universe thought they understood came apart and reassembled itself into the truth. Because they had spent the whole night braced against an abomination, a boy who commanded death, who must surely be a violation of the natural order, a usurper of the grave. And here was death herself, the actual function of endings in this entire reality, looking at that boy with affection and calling him not a thief but a steward. not the enemy of the dead, but their guardian. The one who holds the door exactly as he had told them, exactly as his father had lived it, not to imprison the dead, but to protect them, to keep them faithful and at peace on the far side of the end, while things like the fragment tried to tear that door off its hinges and feast. "My father," Suho said quietly, looking at her with something close to wonder, "told me the authority was a weight, a burden he carried so no one else had to." "Your father," Death said, with the gentle certainty of one who had surely met him at some crossroads of the worlds, "understood it better than almost anyone ever has. The dead are not a thing to rule, little king. They're a thing to care for." She glanced at the fragment, recoiling and ravenous at the edge of the hush, and something in her gentle face went for just a moment sad. "That," she nodded at the monarch's splinter, "is the opposite of what you are. It makes endings and tends none of them. It eats the door instead of keeping it. It is the loneliest thing in all the worlds, and it will never ever be full." Her eyes returned to Suho, and her smile came back, and she said the thing that gave him the rest of what he needed. "You've been afraid that taking up the whole of it will make you into something like that. It won't. It can't. Because the difference between a monarch and a monster, little king, isn't the size of the power. It's whether you carry it for someone." She reached out and touched his shoulder the way she had surely touched a billion souls at a billion endings, gentle as a sister. "You carry yours for everyone, so carry it, all of it. I'll be here when you're done, I'm always here, but not for you today." And sung Suho, seen, at last and completely, by the one being in all of creation who could truly see what he was, let go of his fear, and took up the whole of his inheritance. The shadows that rose then were not an army. They were an ocean. The full and unreserved authority of the sovereign of the dead, the inheritance his father had borne alone in a doorway at the end of a world, and the boy wore it now without flinching, because Death herself had told him what it was for. He became, for one terrible and magnificent moment, the thing the censors had feared, and the thing the universe had needed all along. Not Death's enemy and not Death's thief, but Death's faithful guardian, the shepherd of the slain, the keeper of the door. And he turned the full weight of that authority upon the thing that had come to eat his second world the way it had eaten his father's first. The fragment of the monarch of destruction screamed, the first sound of fear it had made in its long, devouring existence, and the ocean of shadow closed over it, and the keeper of the door did what the door is for. He sent it through, to the only place a thing that makes endings and tends none of them was ever meant to go. To the end, the real one, the one even a monarch of destruction cannot eat. When the dark cleared, the monster was gone, not bound, not banished, but unmade, finished, returned to the silence on the far side of the door it had spent eternity trying to break, and the city stood ruined and saved beneath a sky going pale with the first true dawn it had seen all night. The shadow army sank back into the ground. The ocean receded behind the boy's eyes, and Death of the Endless, her work in this corner of the war complete, gave the little king a last small smile, and was simply, gently, no longer there. Suho stood alone at the eye of the stilled battlefield, swaying, hollowed out by what he had carried and let go of, and slowly, one by one, gods and warriors and the young heroes who had claimed him, the protectors of this universe, lowered their weapons and looked at him with eyes that had finally, fully changed. They had spent the night deciding what he was. Death herself had answered the question for them, and the answer had recontextualized everything. The void on their sensors had never been a threat at all. It had been a guardian, the same shape as the thing he guarded against. A hole shaped like death, because he stood in death's doorway not to take, but to keep. There was only one heart in the city that the revelation did not soften. On a broken rooftop, in the gray of the dawn, the Batman had watched the boy command an army of the dead, watched Death of the Endless call him a king, watched a 16-year-old take up the authority that ends apocalypses, and then set it back down and become, again, just a tired kid standing in the rubble. And Bruce Wayne, alone among all of them, took out the contingency he had built in the dark and did not tear it up. The dawn came up over a city that should have died in the night, and did not, and the protectors of Earth stood in its rubble, and looked at the boy who had saved it with eyes that would never again mistake him for the thing their censors had screamed about. They had spent a whole night deciding what Sung Suho was. The answer in the end had not come from a censor or a debate or a fight. It had come from death herself, kneeling in a battlefield to call a frightened teenager a shepherd. And now, in the gray light, the heroes who had surrounded him with raised weapons gathered around him instead with something he had stopped expecting from this universe: gratitude. Superman, who had asked the only question that mattered. Wonder Woman, who had named him a warrior. Black Adam, who inclined his ancient head a full degree deeper than before. The Titans, who had claimed him as one of their own. Earned recognition, paid in full, to the heir who had proven across one long night that the authority over death was, in the right hands, the fiercest guardian of life that any world could ask for. All of them except the one in the dark. The Batman came down off the broken rooftop as the others dispersed, and he found the boy alone in the rubble, and he did the thing that he, of all of them, had decided the night required. He told him the truth. "I built a way to kill you," Bruce Wayne said. No preamble, no cruelty, just the flat, cold honesty of a man who had spent his life refusing comfortable lies. "I started the moment I saw you swallow that energy bolt without trying. I finished it while you were telling us about your father. And I watched you command an army of the dead, set it down, and walk away a tired kid, and I watched death herself bless you." His eyes did not waver, and I kept it anyway. Suho looked at him for a long moment. He could have been angry. The Titans, when they heard, would be angry. But the boy who had been raised by the loneliest protector in his own universe looked at the loneliest protector in this one, and what crossed his young face was not rage. It was recognition. "Because power that size can't be left without an answer," Suho said quietly, "no matter how kind the hand holding it." Something flickered in the Batman's cold expression. Surprise. That the boy had said the exact sentence written at the top of the contingency. "My father carried the authority of death so no one else would have to," Suho went on. "He became the thing that frightens the world so the world could sleep. He never wanted it. He just understood that someone had to be the one who held the terrible thing." He met the older man's eyes, and there was no accusation in it, only a strange and aching understanding. "You're the same. You built a knife for every friend you have, and you carry every one of them alone so that if the worst ever comes, you'll be the one who has to do it and no one else will have to live with it. That's not hatred, Mr. Wayne. That's the loneliest kind of love there is." A small, sad, knowing smile. "I'd never ask you to tear it up. My father would have built one too." And the Batman, who had braced for fury, for fear, for the boy to prove him right by reacting badly to the worst truth a man can offer, stood in the rubble of a saved city and found, for one of the very few times in his life, that he had been understood by someone he'd come to destroy. He did not soften. He did not apologize. The contingency would stay filed in the dark, because power was power and that fact would outlive them both. But something passed between the worlds deadly. Sent contingency and the heir of death's own authority, two beings who carried terrible things alone so that others wouldn't have to. And it was not forgiveness, and it was not friendship, and it was something quieter and rarer than either. It was respect, between two men who had each agreed to be the answer no one else could bear to be. "Go home, kid," Batman said at last, and from him that was almost tenderness. "Before this universe gives you a reason to need that file." The way home was waiting where it had always been, the scar in the wall between worlds, the breach the fragment had torn, still humming faintly at the edge of the city where everything had begun. The House of Mystery's keeper had studied it through the long night, and the verdict was simple and merciless. The tear could be sealed, had to be sealed, before something else came through to feed. And the same sealing that closed the door behind the predator would close the door behind the boy. There was no version where Suho stayed, and the wall was made safe. He had to choose, and the choice was harder than any of them had expected, because the universe that had met him with weapons had become, somewhere across one impossible night, the first place he had ever belonged outside his father's house. The Titans made their case, and Raven made it hardest of all. "You could stay." She said it quietly, the others fanned out behind her, Shazam's hopeful grin, Starfire's open warmth, the whole found family the night had given him. "There's a place for you here, Suho, with us, people who get it. You don't have to go back to being the only one who carries it." Her dark eyes held his, and the unspoken thing that had run between them since the alley, since the moment two children of terrifying inheritances had reached into each other and found, against all expectation, home, was suddenly very close to being spoken. "You don't have to be alone." And Suho looked at her, at the one soul in this entire universe, who had seen the ocean behind his eyes and not flinched, who knew exactly what it was to be feared for your blood, who had been the first to believe him and the deepest to understand him. And he wanted, with everything in him, to stay. "My world has a shadow monarch's authority. Loosen it again," he said, and his voice was steady and his eyes were not. "Mine. It woke up in me for a reason. There are doors back home that only I can hold now the way my father held them. If I stay here, I'm safe and I'm happy and I belong." His composure thinned, "and my own world goes unguarded." He never got to choose between the burden and the life he wanted. He just carried it, I think. I think that's the rest of the inheritance. Not the power, the choosing. Raven understood. Of course she understood. That was the whole tragedy of the two of them, that they understood each other completely, and that the understanding was exactly what made it impossible to ask him to stay. "Then go be your father's son," she said softly. They did not say the thing. Neither of them. It hung in the gray dawn between them, enormous and unspoken. The recognition, the current, the almost that had run beneath every moment since the alley, and they both knew that to say it now, with the wall about to close forever between their universes, would only make the closing unbearable. So they left it unsaid, the way the deepest things are always left unsaid, and that silence ached louder than any confession could have. Suho stepped toward the rift. The keeper of the house of mystery began the sealing, the breach beginning to knit closed, the light of his own universe shining through from the other side. And at the threshold he stopped and turned and looked at her one last time. "Where I come from," he said, "my father proved that the wall between worlds can tear, which means it can tear again." A pause and the smallest, saddest, most stubborn flicker of hope. "I held an apocalypse in my hands tonight and let it go. I think I can learn to do the harder thing. I think I can learn to leave a door open." He raised one hand toward the ceiling rift, and the authority that had unmade a monarch of destruction reached out and did something far gentler than anything it had done all night. As the keeper closed the wall, Suho's shadow slid into the seam, a thread of his own dark, woven into the scar between universes, the way his father had once rewritten the laws of reality itself. Not a hole, not a wound, a thread. A single line of the Shadow Monarch's authority, stitched into the boundary between two worlds that had not known each other's names a day ago, and now never could forget. "A way back," he said. "For me, maybe, someday." His eyes found Raven's across the closing rift, and the unspoken thing flickered there one final time. "Don't seal that part. Whatever else you close, leave that part open." Then the light took him, and the wall mended itself around the single THR. Eid he had left in it, and Sung Suho was gone, home, to his own world, to his own duty, to the burden his father had carried and the door only he could hold. He left marked, not as the monster they had feared on a screen full of red, as the protector his father had been, the son of death who had chosen, every single time, with gods and tyrants and a contingency builder all watching, to shield the living, the keeper of the door, the shepherd of the dead, the fiercest guardian of life that either universe had ever produced. And he left things behind him. He left a Justice League that would never read its censors the same way again, that knew now there were worlds beyond their own, and protectors beyond their own, and that a whole shaped like death might be the truest friend a universe could have. He left a contingency, filed in the dark, kept by a man who understood the loneliness of carrying a terrible thing for everyone, kept, but no longer aimed at an enemy, aimed now at a friend. He left a tyrant unsatisfied. On his throne of fire at the edge of creation, Darkseid had watched the prize he coveted most, the authority over death itself, escape him into a sealed universe, and the Lord of Apocalypse did not rage, because gods of tyranny do not rage. He simply turned his eye to the single thread of shadow stitched into the wall between worlds and considered it and was patient. There was a door now. Doors could be opened. He had eternity, and he had wanted nothing so badly in all of it as the power that had just walked back through the wall. And he left a girl on the other side of a sealed boundary, a daughter of a demon, who had finally met the one soul who saw her, and lost him to the same loneliness that had defined them both. Raven stood in the dawn before the mended wall, and reached out once with her empathy across the seal, along the single thread he had left her, and felt, very faintly, very far away, in a universe that was no longer entirely separate from her own, a warmth that felt like being understood. The thread held, the door stayed open. Somewhere on the other side of the wall, a shadow monarch's son was learning to carry his father's burden. And somewhere on this side, a tyrant was learning the shape of a door, and a girl was learning to wait, and a contingency sat in the dark, and a universe had learned that the most frightening thing its censors ever found had turned out to be its guardian. The wall was mended, but it was not closed. And that, in the end, was the most dangerous and the most hopeful thing of all, because a door left open is an invitation, and two universes now knew each other's names. And the story of the boy who commands the dead and the worlds that learn to fear and love him had not ended in that dawn. It had only found its first door.